When Germany attacked Poland in 1939, France and Britain declared war on Germany. However, France didn't react immediately, and this had a critical impact on the country throughout the war. The situation in France was uncertain. The state economy had not yet recovered from the prolonged economic crisis. There were many unemployed people in the country, and those who had jobs received little pay. French peasants had suffered most from the crisis because they had been prevented from exporting their goods to international markets. The constant changes of government in France and the contradictory half-baked reforms only made the state's economy worse. The confrontation between the far right and the far left continued. Communist calls for rebellion led the French authorities to consider the Reds more threatening than the German invasion. At the same time, French nationalists supported Hitler's actions and insisted that France needed a similar ruler. Both ideas gained popularity among the French people. All of this had led French politicians to worry more about their ratings than about confronting Germany. Mobilization in the country was delayed. Despite the fact that war was declared on Germany, no one wanted to announce the beginning of hostilities. Moreover, they did not want to announce the invasion of Germany either. Instead, the French soldiers were moved to the border with Germany, where they were to await enemy action. Such policy of the French authorities was called phony war. The French army was led by generals who had made their careers in the First World War and relied on the experience of the time. The Maginot Line was created to defend France. This was a network of defensive fortifications in the form of forts and bunkers, often connected by underground tunnels as well as dozens of dugouts and pillboxes. It was 400-kilometer long and 20-kilometer deep, covering the entire Franco-German border. South of it was situated a weaker network of 600 kilometers of defensive fortifications directed against Italy, Germany's ally. To the north of the line, a Belgian defensive chain began, which was also much weaker than the Maginot Line. The French military leadership believed that the German army would be stuck in attacks on the Maginot Line, as it was in World War I on the Western Front. However, they did not plan to invade Germany by themselves, fearing that the French army might also be stuck on German defenses. Therefore, France was not preparing its troops for the offensive. France had more tanks overall than Germany, and the B-1 and Somua S-35 models were better than the German ones. However, their new equipment was scattered among the infantry divisions in small numbers, negating their advantage in quality. In addition, 2,500 French tanks were World War I light tanks. Although technically there were more tanks in France, in reality, the numerical advantage was of no use. Aviation was in an even worse condition because the French generals assigned it a secondary role, considered ineffective. Many French aircraft were obsolete, and French pilots poorly trained. In September 1939, France decided to help Poland and pull back part of the German forces by launching the Saar offensive. However, instead of the planned 500,000 soldiers, less than 100,000 advanced, while the rest of the French soldiers were in reserve. With little resistance, the French soldiers reached the Siegfried Line, which they dared not attack, and after news of the Soviet invasion of Poland, they retreated to the Maginot Line. So the French leadership once again convinced itself that it was impossible to attack Germany. Soon the main force of the German army moved to the border with France, and the French finally abandoned hopes for a victorious offensive. Instead, they decided to wait for the Germans to advance in the hope of stopping them again, as had happened in World War I. Hitler planned to launch an offensive against France in October 1939. However, the German army leadership began to dissuade him, believing that the German soldiers should rest after the war with Poland, rebuild their ammunition, and expand their army. Some German generals generally believed that attacking France was dangerous. They thought that the German army, just as it had been in World War I, would be stuck in one position not a mile ahead. General Walter von Brauchitsch even plotted against Hitler to arrest him if he ordered an attack on France. However, he soon changed his position due to unknown circumstances, and a coup in Germany never took place. For the attack on France, a Plan Gelb was produced. According to it, the German troops were to quickly capture the countries of Benelux, and from there launch a wide offensive on France. In a short time, they had to reach the River Somme and continue to advance to the inland of France. When General Erich von Manstein saw the plan, He called it the New Schlieffen Plan, comparing it to the German Empire's military plan for which it lost World War I. Then he produced his own plan for war with France. The idea was to draw the French into Belgium and then make a tank attack through the Ardennes to break through the defenses, enter the rear, and thus launch an offensive deep into French territory. However, Manstein's plan was rejected. Winter that year was the cruelest frosts. Waiting every day for the Germans to attack, in contrast, the German army wintered in the barracks, as Hitler didn't decide to launch an attack. On 10th of January 1940, a German military aircraft landed in Mechelen, Belgium. On board was Major Helmut Rheinberger with the Gelb Plan documents. It is not known whether this was due to weather conditions or whether the pilot was mistakenly flown into Belgium or whether he was brought by the Allies. However, the Gelb Plan fell to the French, and the German generals had to use Manstein's plan, which from that moment became the new plan of attack on France. In March, losing support from his party, Prime Minister Édouard Daladier resigned. Paul Reynaud, who succeeded Daladier, undertook economic reforms and postponed the war, believing that France would not fight without the help of its allies. During the spring, France was able to muster more than 2 million troops. Another 200,000 soldiers arrived from Britain, and by the end of the war, the number of English soldiers in France had doubled. French and British Allied forces deployed along the Franco-Belgian border. In addition, 600,000 soldiers of the Belgian army and 400,000 soldiers of the Dutch army were under French command, led by General Maurice Gamelin. In total, there were just over 3 million soldiers in 135 divisions. Germany assembled 2,800,000 troops against them in 137 divisions, divided into 3 army groups. The Army Group C was to occupy the French troops on the Maginot Line with minor battles. The Army Group B was to attack the Netherlands and Belgium. The Army Group A was to make a breakthrough in the Ardennes and enter the rear of the Allied forces. The main force for the breakthrough was General Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army, which consisted of 5 tank divisions, half of the tank divisions of the entire German army of the time. The Allied forces had no common plan of action. France hoped that Belgium and the Netherlands would delay the German army while the French prepared for war, and that Britain would send reinforcements. Belgium and the Netherlands, for their part, did not plan to defend themselves for long, relying on the rapid assistance of the French army. Britain hoped to wage war with little blood, limiting itself to one expeditionary force which it sent to France. In general, there was no single command center, and the Allied generals did not trust each other. On 10th May 1940, German aircraft began bombardment of the Benelux countries. At the same time, the paratroopers of the 7th Flieger Division were dropped in the rear of these countries' armies. They carried out sabotage, seized important transport hubs, and attacked enemy troops from the rear. Thanks to the paratroopers, the Germans were able to break through the Belgian defenses at Eben-Emael. This was a failure for the Belgian army, and it began to retreat westward. The 5-day bombing of Rotterdam destroyed the entire city. Hitler threatened to bombard other cities in the Netherlands. The German army was able to occupy more than half of the country at the time, and its paratroopers in the rear tried to capture a number of cities, although this did not have much success. To save the population from bombardment, on 14th of May, the Dutch army capitulated. The British and French, trying to balance the situation, began to move most of their troops to Belgium. There they hoped to detain the Germans. On 12th May, however, Army Group A, under the command of General Gerd von Rundstedt, began to move through the Ardennes and reach the Franco-Belgian border. The strike was directed to the positions of the weakest French 9th Army, led by General André Corap, whose 7 of the 9 divisions were formed from newly mobilized recruits and were intended to guard the rear. The French 9th Army could not resist the 1st German Panzer Army. Their one-day bout was called the Battle of Sedan and ended with the French fleeing the battlefield. As a result, there was a significant gap in the defense of France. On 13th of May, the Germans occupied Sedan, from where they moved west to the English Channel, directly behind the Allied forces in Belgium. The Allied army, aware of the peril of the encirclement, began to retreat to the sea. The French army tried to cut off the German troops which were entering the rear from the flanks. However, this offensive was poorly prepared, and the approach of the German reserves finally halted it and allowed the Germans to advance further west. On 20th of May, the Franco-British army in Belgium was cut off from the rest of France. The Belgian army, supported by some French forces, resisted until 28th May, but because of the loss of most of his country, King Leopold III of Belgium decided to surrender. Franco-British forces at Dunkirk were largely saved from a final defeat because Hitler halted the offensive on 23rd May. The reason is not yet known. According to one version, the Germans feared to strike on their flanks and therefore turned back some troops. On the other hand, Hitler hoped to negotiate with the British. There is a theory that the German troops were exhausted during the offensive and were not ready to fight for Dunkirk. It is also known that German Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring asked Hitler to leave it to the German Air Force to destroy the Allied forces at Dunkirk. He wanted his share of the glory in the war against France. Historians still have no single explanation for Hitler's decision. As early as 20th of May, the British began to prepare for an evacuation when more than 900 ships, both military and civilian, began transporting British and French soldiers to Britain. From the sky, they were covered by more than 400 aircraft which were holding back the German bombers. In total, 340,000 soldiers had been saved at the end of the evacuation on 4 June. Half of them were British, a third French, and the rest were the Belgians. Not all were saved. 40,000 French soldiers were captured by the Germans. 2,500 guns, nearly 90,000 vehicles, and 70,000 tons of ammunition were abandoned in Dunkirk. The defeat in Belgium was a real disaster for the French troops. Half of the army was defeated. The combat-capable divisions were lost in battle. The day before, the commander of the French army, General Maurice Gamelin, resigned. General Maxime Weygand, who had replaced him, had little to do about the situation. He decided to accumulate troops in the hope of keeping the Germans at the frontiers he had inherited from his predecessor. This created a defensive line along the rivers Somme and Aisne, which went down in history as the Weygand Line. On 5 June, the Germans began to implement a new plan of attack deep into France, which was called Rot. The French tried to resist, winning many minor battles, but the Germans now had a considerable numerical advantage. The return of 100,000 French soldiers from Britain without a British Expeditionary Force could not remedy this situation. On 7 June, Army Group A broke through the Aisne riverfront and headed to the Franco-Swiss border. Thus, they entered the rear of the French troops standing at the Maginot Line. On the other hand, the Germans came to the eastern flank of Paris. Meanwhile, Army Group B had crossed the Somme and forced the French to retreat to the Seine River, where they began to build a new line of defense. On 10th June, Italy declared war on France in the hope of snatching more land from the country that was losing rapidly. The Italian advance was halted by 6 French Alpine divisions. Taking advantage of the defenses in the mountainous terrain, they restrained the more powerful and numerous enemy forces. The Italians were unable to capture French territory except for several mountain passes and the town of Menton. At the same time, the Germans approached Paris. French authorities evacuated to Bordeaux. After 4 days of battle for the city, the French army left the capital. On 15th of June, Army Group C attempted to storm the Maginot Line but failed. French soldiers, those surrounded, were prepared to fight and had enough supplies to hold the Germans back. For the same purpose, another line of defense was established south of the Loire River. French politicians, however, had a very different opinion. Philippe Pétain was elected prime minister on 16th of June. He promised to negotiate with Hitler and did indeed begin the week-long negotiations. Hitler insisted on the unconditional surrender of France, and Pétain agreed to it. On 22nd June 1940, in the forest of Compiègne, where Germany had once surrendered, Pétain signed the Act of Surrender of France. Hitler insisted that this should be done in the same car of Marshal Foch, where in 1918 the Germans signed a truce and ended the First World War with their defeat. For France, the War of 1940 was a disaster. Germany took Alsace-Lorraine province, rich in resources. The Nord-Pas-de-Calais region was moved to the puppet Reichskommissariat of Belgium and northern France. Another 2/3 of the state was occupied by German soldiers. Over the next 4 years, the remaining lands were ruled by the puppet government of Pétain, which made Vichy its capital. Hence, the name of the government of collaborators came, the Vichy regime. Even Italy, after the surrender of France, took part of its lands. The French people were divided into those who supported the pro-German government of Pétain and those who supported the Free France of Charles de Gaulle from London. It took a long time and an even greater effort for the supporters of a free France to celebrate their victory, and for the Vichy government led by Philippe Pétain to be sentenced to death for crimes against the state.